Order, and welcome to the Scottish Affairs Committee, rather unusually in the H100 facility in the Fife Innovation Park here in Methil. And we are absolutely delighted to be here today for what is our first session in our hydrogen carbon storage inquiry. And we're thrilled to have a couple of stellar guests with us to kick things off, who I will now allow to introduce themselves. We'll start with you, Mr. McIntosh.
How about now? Oh, that's better. Okay, well, my name's Gus McIntosh. I've been in the energy industry for over 20 years, working on hydrogen for over a decade. My current role, I'm Director of Energy Futures at SGN. But what really we've been working on with UK and Scottish governments is the hydrogen option, and that is an option for transforming the system for customers, conversion ultimately of the gas network to 100% hydrogen. So we have a parallel programme of research and development that's managed collaboratively with all of the other gas distribution networks and many other partners across the whole energy chain. And we're working on trying to prepare the system transformation options towards a heat policy decision in 2026.
Grateful. Mr. Wallace.
Thank you. I'm David Wallace with the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult. I've been in energy technologies since 1990, in public and private sector capacities. The Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult supports innovation for the benefit of UK supply chain manufacturers, primarily in offshore wind, wave and tidal, but also in the technologies and the systems that we need to integrate large amounts of renewables into our future energy system, our future decarbonised energy system, and hence our interest in hydrogen as a means of helping that.
Grateful, and thank you both very much for that. And of course, as I said, we are here in Methil, next to the H100 project, and we've all been up close and personal to that wonderful turbine that you've got just around here. Can we just kick things off, and you, possibly both of you, to tell us just how important and valuable you think this is a project, what you hope to achieve by this specific project, and just what your experiences of this have been so far. And we'll start with you, Mr. Wallace.
Thank you. As I said, the integration of offshore wind, of renewables generally, with our energy system is certainly going to include production of means of storing that energy. As we get more and more renewables, there's more and more of an imbalance between when wind turbines or solar or whatever are producing their energy and when it can actually be used in our households or businesses. And so just as we have big stocks of energy at the moment in still some coal and oil and gas, we're going to need stocks of energy in the future stored to some extent. There's also potentially a big export market in green hydrogen in supplying other countries which are seeing that they will have a need and don't have the abundance of renewable energy that we have in Scotland and indeed the rest of the UK. And so we are going to be able to prove the integration of our research turbine, which we have here, a 7 megawatt research turbine with an electrolyser facility producing hydrogen. And our engineers and researchers will have very valuable information, very valuable research for working with UK businesses and researchers and universities to advance our technologies and to advance the opportunities for UK businesses.
Grateful. And to Mr. McIntosh, what impact do you think that the H105 project will have on the hydrogen landscape throughout Scotland and the UK?
Sure. So, look, this is a critical national project, both in Scotland and in the UK, for evidencing a deep decarbonisation solution. And, you know, there's no doubt that we need to decarbonise. This forms part of what's described as the 10-point plan that's been set out by UK government and UK Prime Minister. which is a series of stepped evidential projects towards a heat policy decision for a system transformation conversion of the gas distribution network. But the absolutely critical things for me are that the customer is quite often missed out in the decarbonisation debate. And this is about replacing, for those customers in a low disruption way, the appliances that they're used to. And so we think that that will be very attractive, but that's what we're testing under this programme, along with a myriad of technical evidentiary things. Fundamentally, is this a solution that customers would want and need?
Just for those that aren't familiar with what's happening here in Fife, could you maybe, I don't know, either of you just describe to us exactly what is happening? I mean, what are the steps of this project, and like what's you're hoping to achieve out of it all?
Sure. So what we're actually doing is, this is a bit of a glimpse at what the future looks like. Okay, so it is a turbine tip to burner solution. So the turbine will generate power. We'll be taking direct power from the turbine to supply an electrolyser. That electrolyser will split good old Scottish water into hydrogen and oxygen. That hydrogen will be stored, and then we will distribute it to customers direct to their household. We will be providing the appliances for the customers in the home. These appliances have the same footprint as their existing natural gas appliances, so the boiler is exactly the same in terms of its size as a natural gas boiler. The cooker is the same size as the existing natural gas cooker, and similar, you can have the fires in any shape or form really that they would want. So it is a turbine tip to burner demonstration. We'll be proving all of these aspects. Another critical part of the design of this will be the demonstration home for the customer to come and interact with the appliances and see what they look like in their property before they sign up. But all of that's being constructed here in Fife as a world first.
I mean, I think we were told this morning that initially there are going to be 300 customers that's going to be signed up. Is that right? Yes,
that's right. And 300 is not an arbitrary number. It's a magic number, actually, because what you're trying to understand is the scalability. And in energy terms, there is a thing called diversity of use, which is the likelihood that customers will be using energy at specific times. And that 300 homes gives you sufficient information to scale the evidence up so that you can identify your requirements for larger off-scale wind from hydrogen, for hydrogen production for the whole of the UK.
It's obviously very exciting to see what's happening here. And what do you think you'll require in order to make this scale up for more practical and further use right across the UK?
So we need to complete all of the research and development streams that we are working on currently. We have other parallel projects that are being undertaken. Another one actually in Scotland that we're leading is for our local transmission system, which is a pipeline that we're converting between Grangemouth and Granton in Edinburgh. But there's a collective programme of that work which concludes in roughly 2025 in advance of a heat policy decision. The next stage, if you like, under the 10-point plan, this is what's called the neighbourhood, the first 300. Then there will be a village where the trial will be in the north-west and the north-east of England, potentially. And then there's the hydrogen town and the larger scale development and deployments across the country. So our test for the customer is an opt-in. So we're asking customers to opt in. The next phase will be testing legislation for opt-out. So that will be where you're saying natural gas is no longer compatible with net zero. So you can retain your supply and we will replace it with hydrogen, or you can opt out and install an alternative heating solution if you wish under the next phase, which is the village trial. So the critical things that we're going to need is we need to prepare ourselves for that heat policy decision, and we need to accelerate and make sure we're ready to have the deployment plans off the shelf. And we're doing a huge amount of work with supply chain in ensuring that we've got the right skills, capabilities and people beginning to be mobilised.
Excellent. And just lastly from me, and maybe you could help us with this, Mr. Wallace, is, given this is all new and, obviously there's information campaigns going out, is there any safety concerns being expressed to you about any of the issues concerning this?
I think that's more like...
Right, Mr. McIntosh?
So, from a safety perspective, there's been a huge amount of work done already to date. This is not us just starting this. We've been working on it for best part of a decade, and we're very, very confident that all of the safety aspects are covered. Safety is absolutely sacrosanct for a company like ourselves. That's what we live and breathe every day in natural gas, and we would transfer that same mentality into hydrogen distribution. We are working very closely with the Health and Safety Executive, and in fact all the appliances that have been developed will be accredited to the same level as natural gas, and we've received a letter of assistance from the Health and Safety Executive saying that they're very happy with the process through which we've gone to evidence it. There are differences between natural gas and hydrogen, but fundamentally it's a hazardous substance just in the same way as natural gas is, just in the same way as electricity is, and we have the means to manage that.
Grateful. Thank you. Mary.
Thank you, and forgive me if I'm covering things that you've already answered for us, but am I correct in saying, just to begin with, that it is possible to have a hybrid system of both hydrogen energy and natural gases? Is that the case?
So when you say hybrid, you mean a hybrid of natural gas and hydrogen?
Yes.
Yes, so it's possible to have a blend or a mix of hydrogen and natural gas. In fact, for the first 150 years of the gas industry, hydrogen was about 50% of the volume of natural gas when it came from town gas. So it's not actually necessarily a new thing. Going to 100% is new. So it is possible. Currently, though, we could only blend up to 20% by volume into the system. And the reason for that is the constraint around the customer, the domestic customer, which the current boilers that are installed would be compatible with that. But if you went any higher, then they would need to be replaced.
Right. So in terms of then the national energy grids that are available, because forgive me, I'm learning this morning, national transmission system and also the gas distribution network. Mm-hmm. So how does hydrogen work with both those systems?
So at the moment, what tends to happen is the natural gas is brought in from, say, the North Sea or from interconnectors or from liquefied natural gas into terminals into the UK. Those terminals supply the national transmission system, and from that national transmission system we reduce the pressure and distribute it into towns and cities, and that's the distribution component of it. So that's the current structure. The structure for hydrogen conversion may be a bit different. So certainly for the pipes in every street in every city, they would not change. We would repurpose those, reutilise those. But some of the transmission assets, through both the process of conversion and connecting the new sources of hydrogen, would be additional infrastructure. Yeah.
Excellent. So what would it take then to convert the current national gas network to be 100% hydrogen?
So that's what the full R&D research is doing, and what these customer as well is going to be an important factor in that, because you can't have part of the gas network on 100% hydrogen and next door have the other part on once you've converted it, it is then with hydrogen. So what it would require is really a mandate to change that out for the customers, and that's kind of being tested by the legislation proposed for the opt-out. But I think really important to establish that customers want it and are happy with it.
Yeah. And just for my own context, if this was to be, fully invested in, and we were to move the whole of the UK towards 100% hydrogen, what, I suppose, would it have to be done 300 houses at a time, or could it be opened up to a large scale, we're doing a city at a time kind of thing? How do you envision it working?
Absolutely. Well, we've completed a concept study on that for Scotland specifically, which was really designed for the accelerated hydrogen pathway for Scottish Government's 2030 targets. So within that, we set out how that might work in terms of conversion. It's roughly a 12-year period that you could do it. But of course, it's a function of how many resources, how fast you want to go, and what's the optimal. I mean, I think what's quite important in the conversion process is there's clearly a tolerable time that customers would be willing to be without their energy supply. And at the moment, we would say that's 24 to 48 hours by design. So you know you can speed up if you extend that. You can, and there's lots of optimization you could do around that. But approximately, it would be a 12-year program we would estimate, which could be expedited.
So do you think that this would really require commitment from governments, basically, for it to be a success?
It absolutely requires the mandate. At the moment, we're duty-bound to supply natural gas to customers. And if we have that demand warranty, then we could certainly support it. You also have to look at the market overall, so we're not the only actor in the market, we're just the distributor and the transporter, not the producer. So you have to look at the whole market chain. But fundamentally, the hydrogen option is about infrastructure. Yeah, so it's about, do you want to build that infrastructure, and do you have the right market models in order to make that happen?
Excellent, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon to our panel members this afternoon. I think you've both indicated that the UK government's hydrogen strategy doesn't really match with the potential of hydrogen in the UK. So can you describe how the UK government's strategy for hydrogen could become more ambitious? Should we, for example, be looking more at the supply chain? Should we be looking at producing more green hydrogen, for example?
So I'll let David go first.
So the government strategy does recognise some of the benefits and recognises that we are in a strong position in many of the key technologies for production of green hydrogen. So that's electrolyzers, where we have leading companies. The government in shaping some of its policies and how it's going to deliver support is thinking about, you know, what is the pathway for increasing the projects that those companies will be able to get stimulated by the government programs. What are the projects they'll be able to get that will put them on the right path to be able to compete with all the other countries and all the other companies that are chasing this opportunity as well. One of the key things where we think greater clarity or commitment would be important is funding for organisations like ours to work with some of these key companies and technologies. So, for example, at the moment we are doing a project with a UK developer of electrical control systems that are very important for any renewables and the offshore wind turbines that we develop, and this company is working with our research electrical engineers, but now we're also working with them on what does that need to look like, what do these systems need to look like in order to supply the market that there will be for electrolyzers working with renewables. So there are many opportunities like that need big demonstrations at scale of integration of those technologies with operating wind turbines that are also able to pick out, as we're doing with offshore renewables, pick out those really promising UK technologies and innovators. And at the moment, I think that the government has set the resources for that based on what things looked like a few years ago. There's a lot of interested voices saying there is so much now happening in green hydrogen around the world. There are even bigger opportunities than we hoped for just a few years ago.
Thank you. Just looking at the strategy there with export potential. So is there enough export potential, do you think, outlined in the government strategy? What more could the government do to increase the opportunities for export? I mean, can you export hydrogen like you can export natural gas?
So maybe I'll take that one. And just going back, there are a lot of positive things in the hydrogen strategies. There are still some issues around the business models, which are great to stimulate initially, but we need to look at how we go beyond the 10 gigawatts of production. But fundamentally, that's about market creation as well. And obviously, projects like H100 and if you can create that mandate, then you could allow hydrogen to become a ubiquitous fuel in the UK and beyond. And that gives you great opportunity for export, both of skills and of the hydrogen itself. So I think it is important to look at exports, and there is great potential. Scotland, I believe, one of the studies suggested that there's 180 gigawatts of recoverable installed capacity in Scottish waters, which vastly exceeds both Scotland and largely the UK's requirements. So it could be a fantastic export opportunity. For me, the value is in demonstrating that and getting it moving in your country in the first place, so that the indigenous population benefit from that energy before you really focus on exporting it. But in terms of the practicalities of exporting it, pipeline technology is the best way to move hydrogen about. You can move it about in a secondary form, such as ammonia or even methanol to some extent. But the best way is through pipeline technology, yeah.
And that already exists for natural gas?
There's a lot of pipeline technology that's former oil and gas that's abandoned in the North Sea, pending some decommissioning. There's also and the compatibility of some of these pipelines forms one of the studies that I mentioned there earlier that we're doing between Grangemouth and Granton. So some of those could be repurposed, but even new pipeline infrastructure to move that hydrogen about at scale would be a valuable investment.
And just looking at the ambitions of the strategy, it's not just about the export of gas, it's about skills, it's about manufacturing goods and all that. I think it's probably fair to say that the UK was the leader in wind turbine technology, but you could say that we missed out on maximising the jobs, the manufacturing industry. What are the main risks, do you think, of what we see now in hydrogen potential, both in manufacturing, skills, exports, if our strategy is not ambitious enough?
Well, I think if you take the hydrogen supply chain, you have at the domestic level, we're working with UK manufacturers. It's Bosch and Baxi, two of the largest in the world. We're also for the fire manufacturers. It's largely UK manufacturers, including Scottish manufacturer. For the cookers, again, it's all UK manufacturers. Electrolyzer technology is an area that we need to ramp up in terms of support for developing that skill set within the UK. Storage, other storage technologies absolutely will be key as well, which require more of the supply chain focus. But if you look at the resource and the people, transfer of skills from oil and gas to hydrogen is actually not a major challenge. You have roughly in Aberdeenshire, you've got about 70,000 people employed in oil and gas. Those people, all those pipeline skills, all those chemical engineering skills are transferable to hydrogen relatively easily without major retraining. And if you look at it from a plumbing perspective, the people doing the work in the home, the appliances that we'll be installing are simply an extension course to what they already do for natural gas. There's no significant difference. So the resource piece is about actually you've got all these people already employed in a sector that could be upskilled and able to deliver it. And then from a manufacturing perspective, there's a strong UK base to this, but actually you could go further with a bit more stimulation.
So the benefits are not just in mitigating climate change and reducing carbon emissions, but the potential is huge.
a lot of the value that we have in the oil and gas industry is exporting our skills and expertise globally to the global oil and gas industry, which is going to be declining very rapidly. So potentially we would miss out on the opportunity to preserve all the skills and move them into this new emerging global energy market of green hydrogen. So that would be a huge missed opportunity. We've been incredibly lucky in Scotland in particular in sort of falling into oil and gas and having all the benefit of that, creating the industry and just revenues from the oil and gas itself. And now having another incredible opportunity that is way beyond what any other country in Europe has, for example, and will put us in potentially a similar position to where we've been in oil and gas. We're not going to be an enormous supplier of green hydrogen. That's going to be, the big Middle East suppliers, or Australia is going into this in a very big way. But we will almost certainly have a strong, valuable niche in that global market as it emerges.
So we mustn't let that opportunity slip
absolutely
between our fingers. Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to both our witnesses. First of all, I'd just like to continue a little bit on Sally Ann's theme around ambition. So obviously at the moment we know that part of the reason why we're looking at these things is the drive to net zero, but there's absolutely no doubt that the cost of living and consumer costs for energy is another factor. From an ambition perspective, could we be moving more quickly than we are currently? David Wallace?
I think what we've seen in Ukraine with the disruptions to energy supplies to Europe shows us that a lot of people are taking their eye off the ball on that energy security aspect. That just adds to the impetus of the increasing drumbeat of we're not doing enough for net zero, we're not going fast enough. I think in that big picture sense, absolutely, we could be and should be going faster on our renewables journey. The announcement of a target of 50 gigawatts for the UK overall, the ScotWind round of licensing for offshore wind, and 50 gigawatts target from Westminster for offshore wind is very good in that regard. We need to accelerate the demonstrations, technology development to make sure that we will be able to do something with all that energy, balance out the future energy system, and really reap that full potential. Things have to accelerate. I think it's a challenge for every country, really. Yeah. Things have to accelerate, and even more so now.
Absolutely. And this morning, one of the things that came through very strongly is that the H100 project here is not just the technology, it's the social aspect of getting people's buy-in. Does this potential, support for cost of living, a more smooth cost of energy, is that something that we can utilise to bring people on board? Mr McIntosh.
Yes, there we go, sorry, lost it for a second. Yeah, absolutely. So there are lots of different ways in which you can manage the market and how you can structure the market. Once we have made the decision that we want to go for hydrogen as an option, then there's a couple of things we need to do. One, we need to accelerate the work, the design work, to put the things through planning to make sure that all of these barriers we fully understand. We've got the new legislative processes, things like storage, particularly geological storage. Do we actually have the right legislative frameworks for these? So my suggestion is we need to accelerate that towards that heat policy decision in 2026 so that we're actually ready to deploy. And then when you're looking at it on how this is paid for, and there are great ways potentially of doing that that aren't necessarily the current market model. So if you like, the current base business models for hydrogen are essentially a contracts for difference type scheme, which is very focused on production and a good way of stimulating production. But from a customer's perspective, this is fundamentally about infrastructure. And investment in infrastructure actually suits a regulatory asset-based model. investment where you can socialise costs, over say 40 years between current and future customers. So I think we should be very open to different market mechanisms on how we design and deliver this.
Thank you. My other question is just around the twin track approach that the UK government is recommended in its strategy, supporting both green and blue hydrogen. And again, from our time this morning, I was thinking through to me is there's no one right answer. So I suspect I know how you're going to both answer this. But what do you think of this twin track approach, Mr. Wallace?
I think it makes sense as a means to accelerate hydrogen technology generally. Anybody looking at it in today's context, I think would have big concerns over the financeability of blue hydrogen projects, so that's taking natural gas and then from that natural gas producing the hydrogen. The financeability without government support of major projects based on natural gas, because of that volatility in natural gas price, because of those security of supply issues, which could potentially be exacerbated by then taking natural gas supply to create hydrogen.
So if there's challenges around that then, do you think we'd be more likely to reach net zero if we were looking simply at green hydrogen?
So I think you have to separate the engineering from the market aspects, okay, slightly here. You have blue hydrogen or green hydrogen as hydrogen, yes. And that gives you, the more sources of energy, if you like. What we benefit from with our current network is that interchangeability of sources. So, the current market model, where it's fundamentally index linked to either Brent crude oil or just natural gas price somewhere else, is at the moment extremely volatile, because you have a dominant production in Russia and a dominant demand in Asia. But if you separate that point and you look at that, we're developing lots of new fields now, or we'll be considering developing our own indigenous fields, there are things there are obligations potentially you could put on them to develop X percentage of hydrogen as part of the consenting would be one example of the kind of things that you could do. But I think both have their advantages and disadvantages. Blue hydrogen gives you a means of doing it very, very quickly. So if you look at the conversion on the scale that we're talking about, we could convert the networks a lot quicker with blue hydrogen, because you've got that guaranteed source. With green hydrogen, you can do it, but what you need to do is balance that with storage, because the key value of green hydrogen is the maximum economic recovery of energy from offshore wind, managing that intermittency. So, so having them both at the same time really does benefit. So I think the twin track approach is sensible, but that doesn't mean that there aren't things that you can do within the market to help.
Yeah, so that ambition in terms of moving quickly, that twin track approach is required. My final question then is obviously, given that the UK government is supporting that twin track approach, is there a challenge with the fact that the Acorn carbon capture is only one of the reserve projects from a Scottish perspective?
Yes. Okay. The Acorn project is important from a number of perspectives. One, of course, there's a very significant amount of people employed in Aberdeen who you would want in Aberdeenshire, who you would want to be able to transition. And the effect of not being in the first cluster is that they will lose out on some of that technology development as well, and some of the early deployment. So you would hope that would look to be fast tracked, and we want to be ready to support that as and when it happens. But yeah, you're going to need a mixture of blue and green to move at scale. So without the Acorn project, that would restrict our ability to do that in Scotland specifically, albeit there are other options where there's shipping of the CO2 and a variety of different ways of doing it. But yes, the Acorn project would be an important way of speeding up decarbonisation with hydrogen.
Thank you very much. Do you agree, Mr. Wallace?
With some caveats that I've already mentioned.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair. Great.
Douglas Ross.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon to our witnesses. Just to follow up on that point then, Mr Macintosh, what you said we need to be ready to support the fast track. What are you doing in preparation of that? How are you working alongside the bid as a reserve cluster to hopefully, as I think we all hope, to get into the next round as quickly as possible?
Sure. So from an SGN perspective, what we are doing is we're preparing a design of a pipeline system. We've just undertaken what's called a pre-FEED, which is the pre-front-end engineering design towards a detailed design study which goes through into consenting. So we'll be seeking to progress that through with our regulator to be ready for when the cluster potentially will come online. So we're doing a lot of work, that's including how we would design the sectorisation of Aberdeen's customers, right through to how we would hook in green hydrogen as well as part of that pipeline system. There's a significant project called Dolphin that's happening, that's very exciting, where it's direct production of hydrogen out in the sea, where they've got inbuilt desalination and electrolysis. So we're trying to prepare ourselves to be ready, and I think that's the bit that we need to accelerate, so that it's a relatively low regret option to get you to the point where you could make that heat policy decision and go for it.
Yeah. Another thing you said in response to the chair is customers missed out in the decarbonisation debate. Can you explain that further? How have they missed out, and who's to blame for that? Is it people like yourself or people like us politicians, or a mixture of both?
Well, I think it is a bit of a mixture, actually. So I don't necessarily lay the blame. I think sometimes engineers get very focused on engineering. Sometimes companies get very focused on what their perceived solution is. And indeed, the energy trilemma itself, is security of supply, price, and decarbonisation. It doesn't say customer. So in my view, what's absolutely core to whether or not we're going to be able to decarbonise at pace is whether the customer is going to be happy with the solution. Customers don't buy a car that they don't like, even if it's cheap, right? They want their energy in a form that suits them, that they can use. And we need to make sure that when we're designing decarbonisation, that it's a solution that they want.
And it's an opportunity for them, because in many parts of Scotland, and we've not really touched on this, even being on the grid for natural gas is not possible. I was quickly looking up, I don't know how up to date these figures are. My own constituency of Murray, 28.1% of people are not able to be on mains gas. In neighbouring Aberdeenshire, it's 5%, but you go to neighbouring Highland on the other side, it's 72%. So what do we do to large parts, or particularly rural areas of Scotland, who can't even get onto natural gas when they're seeing other parts of the country moving on to hydrogen?
Well, I think you have to look at this from a whole system perspective, which is almost quite an abused phrase, right? Because when I talk about whole system, I mean everything from waste right through to transport to your power network, to your gas network, everything. And when you look at the advantages of the potential of hydrogen being a ubiquitous fuel across all of these, it completely changes the investment potential in each of these areas and their ability to develop their own localised systems. So I think my answer to that would be we're looking at quite a number of off-gas grid locations as well, where you can get the right ingredients to kind of perfect that recipe. But there's a bit to do yet in terms of proving them.
So could you give examples of that? Because people may be watching our proceedings or read about this and feel like they've been forgotten, not just in this session or recently, but for years they've been struggling being off-grid. And for some it's a choice, they want to live in a remote and rural area, but actually these are some of the people who suffer from fuel poverty more than anyone else. And it doesn't sound like we're in the situation where here in Fife in 2023, 300 homes will be fuelled by hydrogen, yet in other parts of Scotland we're miles and years or decades away from that. What comfort can you provide them?
Well, I think fundamentally, if the demand is there, then you can build it.
But the demand could be from one person. One person, for them, it's I've got cases, for example, with broadband, and someone desperately needs high fibre broadband. and that demand is there for them, but the cost to do it to one property is prohibitive. And we're surely going to see something similar with the properties who currently aren't on the grid.
Look, when you look at it at an individual level, right, then it is expensive. In fact, any of the options for providing energy to individual properties is a very expensive thing. What conversion of the gas network allows you to do is generate this, as I say, system transformation solution to get hydrogen mainstream and ubiquitous. That doesn't mean that it can easily be transferred into every individual property. There are means, of course, of transporting tanks of hydrogen, and that could be used that way, similar to the likes of LPG at the moment. But that's not the immediate thing that we would envisage, but could be something that is born out of hydrogen becoming a widely available fuel across all sectors.
Mr. Wallace, I understand you're obviously more looking at offshore generation, but just in the renewable sector, how much are we going to have to look at on and offshore wind, but other forms of renewable to generate enough green hydrogen if we're going to see this rolled out as much as possible across the country?
Well, to come back to offshore wind, one of the huge advantages is there's such a big resource of offshore wind compared to onshore wind, where for the scale of energy that we hope to have to decarbonise and to create an export market as well, you very quickly run out of the cheap or sensible or acceptable places to develop a lot of onshore renewables. So just thinking about scaling up faster than we've been doing, just the scale of that natural resource means that is a really good option for basing your strategy on and taking offshore wind to really large scale.
There are still competing demands in offshore wind, though, because I think it was the Skipper Expo was on in Aberdeen this weekend, and there are more and more concerns raised with us, as certainly myself as an elected representative for a coastal community, that there could be a balance between renewables offshore, but also there are industries who are struggling as a result. So I was wondering more, and not diminishing the responsibility and opportunities for offshore wind, but what about hydro? What about solar? How much are you looking at smaller, maybe even community projects to meet some of the big targets you're going to have in the future?
Yes, so smaller community projects bring a higher value that can sort of offset some of the costs of solar, which is very highly variable. So solar in the UK is much more variable than offshore wind, particularly in Scotland, where when you get further offshore, that's an incredibly stable renewable energy resource in terms of the production, how little it varies over the year, day to day. So that is one of the key advantages, that when you have a very highly variable resource, such as solar in the UK or in Scotland, which is going up and down and has a huge swing in the amount of energy it produces in winter relative to summer. If you have a lot of that, there are very high costs and difficulties in arranging all of the rest of the energy system to cope with that. So for me personally, it's a case of sort of niche applications which would work very well and perhaps provide local community benefits.
Mr. McIntosh, did you want to add?
Yeah, I was just going to add, there's a lovely phrase in German, actually, called Dunkelflaute, which describes the dark, gloomy bits where there's no sunshine and there's no wind, okay? And, one of the advantages of hydrogen is it's about maximum economic recovery of energy. So it's about, can you use fewer resources generating hydrogen all of the time rather than trying to manage all this variability within your energy system. So I think, yes, every single renewable type has its potential role, and it's how ultimately we integrate them to maximise that recovery of energy and deliver it to customers in a form that they want and need.
And finally, Chair, if I can, just final question. We've got targets to get to net zero 2045 in Scotland 2050 from the UK government. this scheme that we've seen today is going to deliver for 300 homes here from next year until 2027, and then there's the next scale up is, I think you said, the north of England for bigger areas, and then, you know, at what stage could you envisage almost every home or every home in Scotland being covered by hydrogen consumption and the opportunity to have hydrogen?
So I suppose that goes back to the point about mandate, right? If we have the mandate, which is theoretically going to be considered in 2026 for that system transformation.
Is this the opt-out?
This is the UK government heat policy decision in 2026, which can determine that the natural gas system could convert to hydrogen. I mean, given that indication, we need to accelerate, make sure we're ready to deploy. And that's one of the things that we need to do. We need to move forward with the detailed design and consenting work now so that we're ready in 2026 and not be too worried about, that ultimate decision date. It's about trying to accelerate the option in time. The study that I referenced earlier, which again I'm happy to share with the committee, was the accelerated pathway for Scotland, which you can tweak up and down depending on how you put the resources in, was roughly a 12-year conversion process.
Thank you, Chair.
Your response will have to be brief because we've got to get to the next session. The government have now put forward a business model for low carbon hydrogen. It was published a few weeks ago, and I think as part of that there's £100 million funding for up to 250 megawatts. How far do you think this will go to achieving some of the targets, ambitions we've got for this?
The government has stayed in very close touch with what the plans are from industry. So that first tranche, I think they're expecting that there'll be a very strong response from people with projects, fairly large-scale projects that let's just say they will have their pick of good projects probably to use up everything that's available very quickly.
And just lastly, do we need something like contracts for difference to make this work and happen?
So I think those business models are great in the sense that they're going to stimulate some hydrogen production, and that's their design. I think beyond that, you need to look at whole system and all of the different demand applications that you have, rather than either just industry or one focused area, and look at it as a ubiquitous fuel. Right, because quite often the market is kind of dictating these behaviours. They're the existing market. So if you like, when you look at transport, it's very much a different price point than heating, which is different from electricity, which is different from all these other sectors. But actually, once you have hydrogen flowing everywhere, the price would be the same across all of those sectors. And if you take a further step back and say, well, actually, what should in the long term dictate the price of all these markets? It would be the carbon price, which has nothing to do with their current set points.
Okay, excellent. That's all we have time for. We could have asked you a number of further questions, but unfortunately we are now up against it. But thank you ever so much for your contribution today. No. It's a Yeah, order. Sorry, sir. This is a committee of the Westminster Parliament, the Scottish Affairs Committee, and there will be no contributions from members of the public. Sorry about that, sir. No contributions at all. If you're not satisfied with that, please, you're more than entitled to leave the proceedings. But if you are, order. That is enough. Right, please, sir. That's it. Right, could we have our next guest, please? committee, what we'll ask you to do is to just say who you are, who you represent, and anything by way of a short introductory statement. And we'll start with you, Dr. Holmes.
Good afternoon, and thank you for this opportunity to join you in Methil. And one of the things I would like to say about Methil is, you've probably heard it already, but the dock just here used to be Scotland's largest coal export hub. We've now seen the transition with Methil. I believe was the site of one of the first oil rigs to be built in Scotland, and we've now got the H100 project going ahead. So energy transition happening over many years. My name is Dr. Nigel Holmes. I represent the Scottish Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Association. We're the association in Scotland for hydrogen and fuel cells. I've got experience in the energy sector going back to the late 1970s when I first worked for the Central Electricity Generating Board. And since then I've worked in manufacturing, industry, petrochemicals, and I've been in this role for about 10 years. And it's been a fascinating journey, starting from quite a small, essentially a technical association, to where we are now, seeing far wider interest in terms of the deployment of hydrogen as one of the key solutions to help us get towards net zero. Thank you.
Thank you. And Dr. Couto-Phoenix.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm Dr. Jill Couto-Phoenix, and I'm here representing the National Manufacturing Institute Scotland, or NMIS, where I manage a national transition training fund. Just in terms of what NMIS does, it's a group of industry-led manufacturing, R&D, innovation and skills facilities supported by a network of partners across Scotland, all working together to transform the future of manufacturing. NMIS is operated by the University of Strathclyde. It is supported by the Scottish Government, Scottish Enterprise, Highlands and Islands Enterprise, Skills Development Scotland, Renfrewshire Council, and the Scottish Funding Council. It is part of the UK's High Value Manufacturing Catapult. So in preparation for this panel, I would like to acknowledge fruitful conversations that I've had with colleagues at NMIS, at University of Strathclyde, as well as Skills Development Scotland, Scottish Funding Council, Scottish Enterprise, the High Value Manufacturing Catapult, Doosan, PE Consulting, and BIBB in Germany. So thanks for the opportunity to be here this afternoon.
And thank you both very much for your very concise introductions. Can we just start, just a general question, we never asked this of the first panel, is hydrogen the future? And if it is, why do you think that's the case? And maybe you could help us with that, Dr. Holmes.
So hydrogen is absolutely part of the future, but it won't be the only way we can get to deliver net zero. And I think the important thing here is to understand how hydrogen can complement other pathways to decarbonisation. So, for example, electrification and the use of hydrogen could be in heating, it could be in transport, it could be industry. All of these require choices, and the optimum solution is often a mixture of more than one single approach.
And is that your view, Dr. Couto-Phoenix? And what role do you think hydrogen's got in that mix? And is it going to be a significant player? Is it going to be the majority, or is it just going to be part of the general mix?
So, so I agree. It'll definitely be part of a mix, and it really depends on what we would like to do with it and how we see the mix playing out, and so we're at a point where we can determine what we'd like that energy mix and what our energy future will be like. But in order to do that, we really need that unity of purpose. And really that comes with alignment of strategy. So it really depends, because hydrogen, you can make it from so many different ways. It's not like you can just extract it and use it. There's different ways of doing it. And every single path you choose will have knock-on effects on what you invest in, what skills you're going to need. And so, it really depends. So, yes, I agree with Dr. Holmes, but it's up to us to choose, whether it's our only future or it's part.
And could I just add a comment? To meet net zero, we will need hydrogen. We won't be able to reach net zero without hydrogen. And similarly, we won't be able to deliver net zero without carbon capture and storage. And this is where we need all of the technologies working together if we're going to deliver net zero.
I'm just wondering, therefore, what you make of the government's targets. I think the UK government is committed, or its ambition anyway, is to have 10 gigawatts by 2030, while the Scottish Government is 5 gigawatts by 2030. Do you think these are satisfactory targets and ambitions to meet, and do you think they'll meet them?
The targets keep changing, and will we meet them? Yes, I think with all of the work that's going on, we will. But we need to be very careful that these targets are setting up what you might call capacity to produce hydrogen, and that doesn't always translate into tons of hydrogen being made. So you could have lots of capacity, but if you don't use it wisely, you will not get lots of hydrogen. And similarly, you've heard from David and Gus already about building up supply. We also need to think about how we build up the demand to match the building up of supply. Without the demand, the business case really doesn't exist, and we need to find ways of balancing that supply of hydrogen with the demand of hydrogen, either in Scotland, in the UK, or more widely.
And what do you think about the targets? Are they over-ambitious? Do we need interim targets just now, Dr. Cuto-Phoenix?
Nothing more to add to what Dr. Holmes is saying, actually. So.
I mean, obviously, we've been around the H100 facility here, and it's mightily impressive, and I think the whole committee feels that we were pretty much, knocked out with what we've observed here. I mean, we're a long way to go, though, haven't we? And where do you think the most significant contribution from hydrogen could be made? Obviously, we're looking at heat here, and there's transport that's to be covered. Where could hydrogen make the difference?
I could start on that one, and what you saw with H100 is the ability to produce the hydrogen. You have the demand for the hydrogen, but also within that system you've got the storage of the hydrogen, and that ability to store energy so that you can actually map you can decouple when you produce the hydrogen to the time when you need the hydrogen. That is one of the critical characteristics of hydrogen. And you can also extend that, so you can, as Gus said, you can move it around by pipeline. So you can move the time when you produce the hydrogen and the place where you produce it into different places and times when you actually need it. And that is a very important part of the use of hydrogen in the complete full energy system going forward.
And again, just for people who are observing our proceedings, we've discussed blue hydrogen and green hydrogen, and you've mentioned carbon capture and storage in one of your previous responses. I mean, what if we were to pursue one in particular, what one should the most investment go to, or is it again a matter of getting them both right?
This is a great question, and if I can just give an example, and this was just before lockdown. I was in a discussion in Aberdeen around green and blue hydrogen, and one of the comments from another panelist said, well, the customer is colourblind. We can make green hydrogen, we can get blue hydrogen, we can put it all in the pipes, and they don't need to know what it is when it comes out. But I think what you've heard earlier from Gus in terms of the work that they've been doing with the customers here in Methil actually shows clearly that the customer does know the difference between green hydrogen and blue hydrogen. And actually they're starting to express preferences for, ideally, if they're going to decarbonise their homes and make all this work to make it change, they want to actually go for something that they think will actually make a lasting difference. Now, this is not to say that blue hydrogen doesn't have a place. This is just to say where the customer preference is coming from. And that is not unique to consumer. We're also seeing the same from industry. So we have examples within industry where industries are starting to look to go to net zero on an accelerated pathway, but then saying, actually, we want to do it with green hydrogen. And in Scotland, we've got some of the best examples there, where, for example, the whisky sector is expressing very keen interest in using green hydrogen to actually decarbonise distilleries. And as Mr. Ross said, the need for energy isn't just in centralised areas, current industrial areas. It could be dispersed around Scotland. And again, this is where some of the characteristics of where you can produce the hydrogen locally and start to use it locally is absolutely one of the strengths that we can start to play to.
Excellent. Anything to add to that, Dr. Felix?
I mean, I think, again, green hydrogen is, one where it is completely clean in the sense that we have so much wind up in Scotland. So, you know, wind, water, electricity, you know, you can produce it via electrolysis. But I think as well, just thinking more pragmatically and thinking about the work I've been looking at skilling the transition, given that we have these deadlines to 2030 and 2045 and 2050, it seems like we'll need to have a route to green, but we'll have to phase, you know, so right now we have oil and gas looking to phase into renewables, and blue hydrogen seems to be a way that we can phase our workers into the kind of hydrogen economy. And then as this is happening, we can scale up green as well. So I mean, absolutely, it would be great to go straight to green. But I think as well, we have to, you know, carbon capture as well as, you know, producing green hydrogen, I suppose, is also one of those options that might, in terms of workforce skilling and transition, be able to be able to get everybody to where they need to be in over the next 25 to 30 years.
Great, thank you. Sally Ann Hart.
Thank you, Chair. Just looking at the government's hydrogen strategy. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Can you hear me? Is that better?
Yes, we've got you.
It's flashing green. Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. The UK government hydrogen strategy discusses the export of hydrogen-related manufactured goods, expertise and skills. So I think you're probably here with the earlier panel when we discussed the export of hydrogen as well. Do you think that the government strategy should really be looking at export of hydrogen as well? What's the most effective area to concentrate on when it comes to hydrogen exports? Dr. Holmes first.
So the Scottish Government strategy is actually very explicit on building up capacity for hydrogen production in Scotland. It's more about the 2045 scenario, where there would be considerable overproduction of green hydrogen in Scotland. So meeting Scotland's need for hydrogen, but then having additional capacity for production, and that then being available for export into, it could be into the UK, it could be into other countries where there is demand. I guess similar to where we have now in the North Sea, where North Sea oil and gas produces oil and gas, and that could be used either in the UK or more widely. The UK government's the British energy strategy talks about the building up the export potential for goods and for services, but is not so explicit around how you might start to export hydrogen. It talks about putting in place a standard for low carbon hydrogen. I think it mentions 2025 to have that in place. To be honest, if we're going to start exporting hydrogen, we need to think about having the standards in place sooner rather than later. I think David Wallace mentioned some of the speed where people are starting to move, and the speed in Europe and in countries like Germany, you know, they are making a very rapid transition away from being dependent on Russian gas to trying to find alternative ways of importing natural gas, but also future-proofing those facilities, so redeveloping ports, so that they can then import either hydrogen or hydrogen derivatives in the very near future. The danger is that if we're not quick to act in the same way as we missed the opportunity with the onshore wind, we may start to miss some opportunities with building up the position of Scotland, the North Sea, as a major producer of hydrogen for not just UK, Scotland, but also for the whole of Europe.
Thank you. Dr. Coutinho Phoenix, have you got anything to add to that?
No, I mean, I agree the potential for export, and it's really quite explicit in the Scottish Government's Hydrogen Action Plan, is there. But I guess if this is how we're going to go, if this is that purpose, then we really need to drive that forward, because there is so much that would need to be done in terms of the early technology, as well as how we roll it out and scale it up in order to be able to export hydrogen. So we'll just have, for example, the ScotWind projects. At the moment, I was speaking with the SFC about one of the sites, and they said infrastructure from one of the sites, because these are large infrastructure projects, and they said you'd need 5,000 welders just for the one site, and we have 8 sites that we would like to develop. So I'm not saying that we need 40,000 welders, but what I mean is that and that's just the welding jobs for one site. And so that's when we have all the wind up and running, and then we need to, if you're going to produce hydrogen via electrolyzers, you're going to need that capacity of electrolyzers. You'll need all the water. Try and figure out what type of water you need. If you're up in this, are we desalinizing all of our water? And the scale of that, and then to ship it. So it depends on where you want to ship it. If there's pipeline infrastructure, that's great. If it's not, then you have to either ship it compressed or cooled to minus 253 degrees, or as ammonia, minus 33. These are all kind of very big engineering and research projects that will have to be scaled up very quickly. So if this is what we want to do, then we need to have a very different conversation about transitioning our workforces. What skills do we have? What skills do we need? How do we need to invest in it? So with transition training, I've been managing a transition training fund, and it's a stimulus package from the Scottish government, and it was 2 6-month tranches of funding. And what we found was that it's clearly not enough time to transition workers, even if it is short and sharp transition training. If this is what we want to do, we need a long-term transition training fund where we plan, will give us the ability to really work together across all of the provisions. So from higher education, further education, workplace, working with SMEs and companies that are actually working on the ground, transitioning their workforces, will all need to work together to forecast what we need. So that's what we need for green, to export green hydrogen.
So just looking at building up capacity, the supply, when there comes a point where Scotland or the United Kingdom could export hydrogen, what support, you mentioned, Dr. Holmes, about some of the measures that might be needed to be put in place, but what other support would be needed to make the most of international trade opportunities for the export of hydrogen? Dr. Holmes.
So, to take the most of the current opportunities, countries like Germany are looking to start to import green hydrogen derivatives, methanol, ammonia, in the not too distant future. They're starting to go out having dialogue with, and we've heard it already mentioned, Middle East and Australia as countries who are interested in supplying. And why this is important is that we've heard about contracts for difference for supply. So essentially, Germany is putting in place some of these early contracts for difference for supply. But fascinating is that they're also looking at contracts for difference for demand. So as well as starting to find out who is bidding to actually supply hydrogen from outside Germany, they're looking inside Germany and saying, right, who is going to use this hydrogen? So building up this early demand. Because again, if you don't have the market demand for that hydrogen, then the whole construct falls apart. So I think there's something really important about what Germany is doing in actually starting to stimulate this early demand as well. So, sorry, my point, and why does this all matter for the UK, is because along with these early contracts for difference that Germany put in place, they're looking at about 10-year contracts with CFDs, which essentially would help to underpin investment in early hydrogen production projects. So that then becomes part of where we have ScotWind projects starting to set up. They need to have a customer to actually sell that hydrogen to. Without that customer, they don't have a business case. And this is where, both in terms of customers within Scotland, UK, but also Europe, we need to identify those opportunities if we're going to realise the full benefits and get the projects actually happening sooner rather than later.
Thank you. That was very comprehensive. Thank you. Dr. Couto-Phoenix, have you got anything to add to Dr. Holmes's?
No.
Thank you very much. No further questions from me.
Thank you. Sally-Ann, when did you
Thank you very much, Chair, and nice to see both witnesses. In fact, Dr. Holmes, I think we met at St Andrews, didn't we, the COP26 event?
Yes.
Yeah. Knew I placed you somewhere. Thank you very much both for your time today. Dr. Couto-Phoenix, if I can come to you in the first instance, really interested in what you were saying about the transition training funds. Now, Mr McIntosh, in his evidence earlier, suggested that there were some more straightforward transitions in terms of end users. I could certainly see gas engineers, etc., having to do an additional qualification to their certification in order to be able to input boilers. But you were also talking about much more complex transitions. Can you tell me a bit more about what kind of jobs that would be? And then my other question is around certifications. Certainly my own experience of oil and gas is they're not very good as an industry of sort of recognising qualifications in different sectors. Is that something we're going to be on the front foot with in relation to hydrogen?
So to address your question first in terms of the jobs, it really depends on the technology pipeline. But what from querying both SFC and Skills Development Scotland, who work quite closely with the oil and gas industry, there's a lot of potential to transfer things like working in high pressure environments, for example, from the oil and gas industry. But where there's skills is one thing, but really what I've noticed from working in this area is it's all about the people. So you could have the skills, but it really depends on whether you see the potential to transfer, and the demand for the jobs need to be there at the same time.
Yes.
So we can't transition a workforce if there's no jobs for them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So,
and do you think the UK and Scottish governments have given clear enough signals for the industry to feel, or people, individuals, to feel that certainty to start to move?
So in short, no.
Okay.
No. So we do need that unity of purpose. So lots of potential, but we do need to line up our thinking so that we can start to plan, because this is the first time ever we have deadlines that are quite important. And so in order to plan for those and to make the most out of it, we really do need that. And that's why I proposed a longer term transition training fund to specifically to focus on this, because it is a very big task. To go to to address your other question about certification, again, I did float this around people I had spoken with, and it's complicated. It's not something we could tackle in an afternoon, but it is something that universities are aware of, further and higher education institutes are aware of, and it's something that we will have to work with assurance and trade bodies to really start to think about. It'll be something that we transition, because as the Centre for Energy Policy at Strathclyde had a really nice report, and they said for a just transition we can't do business as usual. So that means thinking about everything that we do, and certainly the people, and making sure our workforce is trained to overlap with the demand is going to be really important. And yes, assurances and how we tackle those will be very important.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Dr. Holmes, do you recognise that? How urgent is it for us to ensure that there are work training happening for workers in both blue and green hydrogen?
Absolutely critical. So we already have companies who've got heritage in the oil and gas sector who are starting to be active in the hydrogen sector. One example would be Hydrosun, who do a lot of assembly of components and systems, and they're taking their experience with high pressure fluidics from oil and gas into hydrogen to actually produce mobile hydrogen refuelers, which can be used to help to stimulate and grow the early demand for hydrogen in transport. That's one example. Howdens in Renfrew, they manufacture compressors. They are starting to get inquiries around compressors for hydrogen systems. And we have companies also coming through from the hydrogen fuel cell sector who are starting to scale up. Logan Energy, based just outside Edinburgh, being one example, and I think you mentioned that in your submission. So we have all of this happening. The other comment I would like to add is some of the work done by the University of Strathclyde includes analysis of the job intensity of different forms of hydrogen production. So Professor Karen Turner, a couple of years ago, did some analysis on this. And actually the number of jobs per tonne of hydrogen for green hydrogen is 2 to 2.5 times higher than that of blue hydrogen. It's just a reflection on the type of equipment, the scale of equipment, the way it's actually deployed between green and blue hydrogen. But green hydrogen, essentially, per tonne of hydrogen produced, actually is more jobs intensive on a local level.
That's really interesting, because obviously we're talking about a twin track approach, but it does sound like it's a twin track approach with an end goal of moving to green hydrogen full stop, because not only the net zero benefits of it, but clearly the job opportunities.
Blue hydrogen is seen as being a way of scaling up quickly. What I would add, though, is blue hydrogen, you've got the hydrogen production, then you've got the carbon capture and storage. And the hydrogen production for blue hydrogen may stop, but the carbon capture and storage, the expectation is that those are assets that will be needed in the long term to keep sequestering carbon emissions. So it's a no regrets approach. You actually develop the carbon capture and storage, use it for blue hydrogen, but it then stays there to actually be used for a very long time afterwards.
Okay. My final question then is, the Scottish Government in its hydrogen policy statement said that if Scotland exported green energy to Europe, going back to Sally Ann Hart's questions, it could result in over 300,000 jobs by 2045. Just very conscious that in this space, and we heard it in our previous inquiry as well, there's lots of talk about job opportunities and numbers. Given that the transition oil and gas, we're talking about 100,000, does 300 seem right to you? Are we in the right ballpark in terms of that level of jobs ambition? Dr. Holmes?
I think so. So. I've
really
seen similar reports. Some of the UK numbers are, I think, slightly higher than that.
Okay.
But it is big numbers. The GVA numbers are also very considerable, to a point where essentially the development of the hydrogen production could actually substantially replace the income lost by the decline of the oil and gas production in the UK North Sea. Mm-hmm. So going forward, this is a big transition, but it won't happen overnight. And even when we get to 2045, I would expect that the onward building of offshore wind farms and the building of further hydrogen capacity will continue, because there will be probably an increasing demand going forward for hydrogen as part of a net zero energy system, not just from the UK, but from more widely around Europe.
Very positive, and positive to hear of future revenues as well. Dr. Couto-Phoenix, anything else to add to that?
No, I think Nigel's captured it quite well. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to our witnesses. If I could just dive a little deeper into the sort of the skills issue and transitioning employees over into hydrogen. How adequate are the current transition plans for people who work in other energy sectors?
I don't think we have a framework for transition, so they're not adequate. I think we've had. With COVID was a massive disruption and disruptor, and there was a prediction of lots of unemployment, and we weren't sure what happened with the impacts of COVID were not what we expected in terms of employment. And so at that point, there was the transition training funds, which were very much put the onus on an individual to start to transition themselves. But if given the timeline, and if we are going to do this, we will need to have a framework for transition, and we are working. So, for example, we are working with because we work across the Catapult as well as with all of the skills agencies in Scotland. We're looking at proposing a framework. So there are plans in place of having a transition framework. Where you not only have provision, but you also have to incentivize workers to actually want to do it, as well as have employers who will actually take the time to train their workers. You can't have somebody transition into important jobs like this on their own time, you know, on weekends. They have to have time at work to do this. So it needs to be very structured and very coordinated. So we don't have that, but this is something that would really benefit the transition.
And is that something that both governments are open to, or is it something that you guys are choosing to do independently, you know, getting on with it?
No, I mean, obviously skills is a devolved issue, and so there's they work slightly different in Scotland versus for the rest of the UK. However, because we work with the catapults, they actually had a really good report. It was featuring the manufacturing the future workforce, and this was a report where they looked at not only the work that we were doing here, but also looked at other economies across the world that are quite industrialized and so really again the lessons learned from that is that we do require this, and I know that Skills Development Scotland is, you know, looking at working with working with this framework, and NMIS is part of this because we are working across Scotland. And so, yeah, this is something that I think the governments would be open to, but again, we would need that funding, that continuity of funds to be able to plan a demand-led skills model to 2030, and then to 2045, and then 2050.
Right, excellent. And Dr. Holmes, would you add anything?
Yes, one of the aspects that I'd just like to bring in, and you know, this relates to when you deploy hydrogen into the real markets. So whether it's, as Gus mentioned, you know, households, whether it's using hydrogen for transport. Gus, you know, brought in the question of safety, and how safety is absolutely key. If we don't do things safely, we will lose the public's confidence in hydrogen. So we need to, you know, bake this in right from the start. And you know, some of the skills and training we need are, for example, with the first responders. You know, so the people that actually go out and you know, tackle when things don't work as expected. And I think the number that estimated there was about 20,000 skilled responders, you know, in Scotland, you know, requiring retraining in various ways. And you know, we're also seeing this with, for example, the projects in Orkney, where they're starting to move hydrogen around. They're putting hydrogen in tube trailers. They're putting the tube trailers on the ferries, using that to move the hydrogen. And they have to go through a lot of training for the staff on the ferries, but also the first responders before everybody was happy that this was safe to do. So, in building up the skills, it's obviously key that we have the people who can manufacture the equipment, who can deploy it, design it, all these good things. But we need the people who can also use it, maintain it, respond safely, and actually at the end of the day take it away and recycle it, because increasingly we're going to have to look at recycling of some of the key materials. You know, when we start to look at the deployment of these systems, there will be some of the critical raw materials we need to try and make sure that we have access to, and then can keep using those on a sustainable basis as well.
Is that not a really big stumbling block, though? I mean, at the start of this session, when we were asking about where do you see hydrogen energy in the future and how big a role will it play? And the answer is, we don't really know, it's whatever we make it. In that sense, you have a chicken and egg situation where how can you be training people for jobs that don't exist, but how can you try creating jobs if there's nobody trained up in them? Does that not create a vicious kind of cycle? How do you break out of that?
I think what we've seen in Orkney, you know, is an example of how they've started to create some of the training modules. They've put them in place. They've taken people through. So that's just one example at a small level, but shows how this can be done relatively quickly. So you can actually start to see the first steps being taken. And the key thing here is learning from doing. You know, getting the experience on how you actually deploy things in practice.
Yeah, I mean, and exactly what the framework for forecasting your skills would be. You know, from trying to get evidence for this inquiry. You know, we looked at working across the education providers, so higher education, further education, as well as HND and all the way down to the learner's journey for schools. So it's very, very clear that you know, that skills provision needs to marry up very closely with the innovation, because there are very new technologies that are coming through, and that way we can inform each other very quickly and we can train. And the last really component as well that's really important is the early skills adapters, which are, you know, who are exactly these people in Orkney, but also companies like Logan Energy, for example. You know, they were a wealth of information because they're actually doing it, and they're already, you know, training their workforces. But we all have to work together, because otherwise we'll have this, you know, piecemeal provision, which doesn't work when you want to scale up very quickly. So we really have to have that, everybody working together in order to do this.
Very last question, very quickly. If that's the case, who should be leading the charge?
So I think this absolutely has to be a collaborative approach.
Right.
You know, I don't think there is maybe any one organisation that needs to be leading the charge. You know, there needs to be maybe somebody who's bringing this all together. And if I could just add one comment about the skilling. You know, to reskill, we have the existing workforce, but we also need to think about the workforce that will be coming through over the next few years. How will we actually engage and attract, you know, the people? And this is a classic, you know, sort of, it's a tricky issue in terms of STEM engagement for you know, schools and colleges. And as an example, the Hydrogen Office just here, you know, part of the work that they did, you know, when, you know, for about 10 years was actually engaging with local, you know, schools, you know, primary and secondary schools, even the nursery over there. They were involved in naming the wind turbine on the dock side. And going from that into the, you know, into the college areas, I think there was about 80,000, you know, pupils and students in the Fife area that they engaged with over that time. And we need to continue that. We are continuing that through, for example, initiatives like the Fuel Cell Challenge that's been run in Aberdeen during COP26. It was run as well. You know, this is all about getting people involved and engaged in the hydrogen and fuel cells.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon. Good afternoon to our witnesses. Just to follow up on that, because I was thinking as Wendy and Mary were speaking, understandably we look a lot at the current workforce and the transition from those working in oil and gas to these new sectors. But that sounds very positive about what's been done with young people here, but this is on their doorstep. How do we translate that to other parts of Scotland where there could be young people with an interest, but there's no local footprint for them to kind of make that connection between hydrogen now, what they might be planning to study or doing exams in at the moment, and future careers? Is there enough done to extend it out with the locality of where there is a base of interest?
So very, very good point. And you know, there have been some, you know, discrete local initiatives. You know, so here, Aberdeen, you know, Glasgow, but we need to do this more, and we need to do it, you know, more consistently. And this is where, you know, hydrogen and what we're doing, it shouldn't be taken in isolation from, you know, the need to basically engage young people around the wider science, technology, engineering, maths, you know, subjects. And this is where working with some of the existing initiatives, so the STEM ambassadors, for example, that go to schools throughout Scotland, you know, we're starting some of the discussions about how our sector could actually start to make more of a participate and contribute towards these activities, because this will be key going forward. So it's not about creating something that is separate from other initiatives. It's actually just trying to see how we can build on those initiatives to take forward.
And do either of you have concerns at the moment that in some areas there's not the availability for young people to learn all the subjects that they would need? You know, some of the sciences are restricted because there's not enough teachers, there's not enough young people choosing those subjects, and therefore we could have great opportunities, but because maybe over the last 5 or 10 years there's been a restriction in the amount of sciences that young people can study, that's going to have a huge knock-on effect, not just for them, but for the industry going forward.
Yes, potentially. I think what we do have in Scotland is a very good network of colleges, and they are, you know, through the Energy Skills Partnership, you know, taking a very active role in this. And we can also think about some of the work that the Open University has done as well, to allow access to people who can't, you know, attend university on a permanent basis, you know, gives them more flexibility. So there are approaches that I think could be very useful.
Dr. Goto-Phoenix.
Yeah, going back one step to STEM in schools, and you know, just the general awareness building of net zero. Skills Development Scotland has their climate emergency skills action plan. Sorry, the CSAP. You know, is one of the objectives is to build a green jobs skills hub, and this is something that everybody can access. There's also the My Climate Path initiative, where you do go, it's an ambassador type role, and you go into schools and you work with schools to try and understand net zero. So it's, you know, it's just at the early stage of our energy transition. It's just building up that general awareness of net zero, and hydrogen certainly being part of you know, the energy mix. But I think there's little just across society. There's not the understanding that needs to be in terms of where we are for our targets for net zero, and certainly this is something that we could do more of. You know, if we had more of a directive for transition training. It is an opportunity that we are trying to make. We're building momentum, and certainly with NMIS and the work we're doing with the Manufacturing Skills Academy, there is a lot of work targeted at young people and developing that young workforce. You know, it's coming.
And looking wider than just younger people, do you think if we'd had this discussion about hydrogen 6 months ago at the peak of COP26, net zero was a buzzword everyone was using. The world has moved significantly since then. Do you think global events such as the energy crisis, the situation in Ukraine, the clear sanctions against Russia has changed the public's mood on net zero, and actually, while everyone's worried about climate change, it's not the priority it was for a lot of people 6 months ago because of these global events?
I mean, it depends. I think net zero in the sense of net zero and sustainability, and we definitely were thinking about. We came across this when we were trying to develop CPD for one of our transition training programs, and it is a, you know, you call it a buzzword, but it means so much. It means so much. And I think that general awareness piece is really something that we really need to do more about if we are to get people to take action on net zero, because it can mean different things to different people. And in order to translate that into a green job, you know, we have to understand that our jobs will be greened over time as we transition. So it'll be workers who are transitioning. It'll be provision, how we, you know, our provision will transition. And so students now might have to be going into jobs that aren't green at the moment, but will become green, you know, as they move towards. So in hydrogen, you might have to start in oil and gas, and then move to blue, and then move to green. And that was from people working in Skills Development Scotland, looking at the new provision. So, you know, really, it's at this moment in time, that awareness piece for across all of us, and how we're going to have to do that, how we're going to transition will actually then inform how we actually get people into jobs and how we educate everybody about the transition.
Because Dr. Holmes, you were saying at the start of your evidence that actually some people are very immersed in this and choose between blue and green, so they clearly have an understanding of what's going on. But we also saw some information earlier on today that while a significant proportion of the population is happy to make adaptations to their homes to help you know, tackle climate change, when they're asked to pay for that, particularly now in a cost of living crisis, their eagerness to do so diminishes because there are other priorities.
Yes, it's a difficult situation, but I think there could be opportunities where we can achieve both the climate targets and also security of supply of energy at a reasonable cost. But we will also need to be pragmatic about how we approach this. So, you know, one of the opportunities for hydrogen is deployment into transport markets, and the work that's been done in Aberdeen is using hydrogen fuel cell buses, which is great. You know, they're super quiet, you know, no pollution from the buses. But there are also opportunities to use hydrogen to displace directly the use of diesel in engines. So you actually have combustion engines that run on hydrogen. Now, you probably wouldn't want that in a bus, but for a heavy goods vehicle that is driving up and down motorways for a lot of the time, that could be a very, very appropriate way of decarbonising the transport. And if we can achieve some of the targets with the scaling up and the cost reduction of the hydrogen, then the price of that hydrogen for transport markets will be super competitive with the existing petrol and diesel. And it starts to get us away from that dependency on any imported fuels. So there are, I believe, areas where we can actually make things better on both fronts, but we probably need to be very pragmatic about how we do that. Don't just go out looking for the perfect solution. Look at some of the ways we can actually make big steps that get us towards greenhouse gas reduction, and that can actually get us a long way there.
Yeah. And that leads me on to my final question, Chair, if I can. Dr. Holmes, you mentioned whisky, and there's more whisky distilleries in my Murray constituency than anywhere else, and indeed the vast majority of those are situated in Speyside, where we don't have access to the grid. So do you see this progress towards hydrogen happening at the same pace between residential properties and businesses and industry, or do you think industry will go ahead first and then hydrogen in homes will catch up, or will they both roughly move at the same pace?
That's a very good question. So don't hold me to the answer. Can I give opinions rather than facts on this one?
No, that would be good. And we'll come back to you in a few years' time.
Exactly. So the work that's going on in Invergordon maybe gives a sense of how this might pan out. So Invergordon, Scottish Power are deploying a green hydrogen production project, and it looks like one of the anchor demands will be the grain distillery, which is adjacent to the Invergordon site. And at the same time, they were looking at the potential, SGM were looking at the potential as a concept that grain distillery currently gets their gas coming up the gas pipe from Inverness. They thought about turning the gas distribution network around, the transmission network, and pushing hydrogen from Invergordon back down to Inverness. It's a pipe. And Gus will probably say, well, you can't do that. But in principle, you might be able to make it flow both ways. Why does that matter? So, for example, in Speyside, you've got, down the Spey, you've got distilleries like Tormore, I think Glenlivet, are actually on their own little gas network that was put in quite recently. And that also maybe leads towards areas that could be suitable for renewables. So you could possibly start to have a little micro network within Speyside. And what would prompt that? Well, it could be if the distilleries are saying we want to go for net zero sooner rather than later. There's the infrastructure in place that could potentially open up this as an opportunity. So the answer to your question is, I think it could be industry-led to start off with. The whisky sector is very much looking at decarbonising early. Why? Because the whisky they produce now, they don't sell for another 12, 15 years. And they're starting to anticipate what will the market want in 2030s, 2040s. So the answer probably is, it's a luxury product. People were looking for very high environmental credentials going with that product. So it's a fantastic opportunity, and hopefully, in 5 or 10 years' time, we can actually test to see whether this is right. The whisky sector could be a major factor in helping to move this forward. But there are others who can help as well. So, for example, the water utilities are also going very much for net zero by 2030, and they could also be a key part in helping us to move forward on this.
Great. Thank you. Do you want to add anything?
No, it's just, I think about industry is also motivated by regulation and legislation, while as homes, I think as consumers, we're motivated by how much our energy bills are going up or down, or what the cost of living is. So I think if it's cheaper, then I think homes could, if we could get it in a way that would not lead to fuel poverty, then yes, I think our residential networks would be the first to take it up. But I think industry has that, with the SCCR legislation for large companies, and then them wanting to decarbonize their supply chains. There's definitely that motivation. There's a clear driver. There's also that, being a business that's certified and doing the right thing. Well, as for consumers, it is very much, with the cost of living, it's very much on whether we can afford it or not. So.
Thank you both. Thank you, Chair.
I'm not optimistic about all of this. Where do you think we'll be in 10 years? Will we be along the path of the 10-point plan will we be securing and realising our ambitions. And just in answering that, there was just one thing that struck us, I think, about our visit here today and the public engagement exercise that's going on just now. And perhaps we could describe it as maybe not the most understood of technologies. And there's a discussion about maybe we should just call it green gas as opposed to hydrogen, with all its sort of like similarities with the Hindenburg or a periodic table. I mean, what do you think we have to do to get there? And do you think we will get there? And are you optimistic that we're going to meet these targets?
I think we should call it hydrogen because that's what it is. And when you talk about Hindenburgs and H-bombs, these are absolutely the things that come in people's minds when we start talking about deployment of hydrogen, either in terms of in homes or in transport. And I think to dress it up as green gas, would probably cause more, I think, concern than actually just calling it hydrogen. Let's call it what it is. And what we need to do is then work carefully as a sector to make sure that as we deploy things, these are done in absolutely the right way. You heard that from Gus in terms of the requirement to make sure that the safety of using hydrogen in homes for heating is absolutely correct. We need it in the transport sector to make sure that cars, buses, lorries are all done safely. The refuelers are done safely. Because if we don't do this, and if there are incidents, that will undermine the public's confidence in hydrogen as a fuel. And we have seen this to an extent happen already. In Korea, there was quite a bad accident which undermined public's confidence in Korea. And there's been demonstrations in some locations against the deployment of hydrogen systems. So we need to learn from not just what's going on in the UK, but also keep an eye on what's going on more widely. The other key thing is, some of the communications we put out about hydrogen in the UK, we need to be consistent with what is going on elsewhere, because in a world with social media, you will get images from around, anywhere where hydrogen is being deployed. You will get comments from anywhere. So we need to make sure that we are consistent, but we're also ahead of the curve when it comes to actually the deployment.
Thank you. And Dr. Kuto-Phoenix, do you think we'll get there and realise our ambitions?
I think, I'm an eternal optimist when it comes to these types of things, but I think that if we want to have a good chance of getting there, we'll need to plan, because otherwise we definitely won't get there. So I think in order to plan, we do have to see it as a transition and have a very, very focused plan on how we're going to get there. Skills, will be a very important part. So really it's about getting skills up on that front page, because they will be able to get us where we need to be if we plan for it.
Excellent. Well, on that very positive note, I think we'll have to end these proceedings. But thank you both ever so much for joining us today. And once again, to thank everybody in the innovation part today for their hospitality and putting up with us for the course of what's been most of the day. But for today, order, order.